Happy New Year! Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and since we're into September, I thought it was a good time to talk about the fiscal year. Now, just to get things started, it is fiscal year, not physical year. There's no such thing as a physical year. So if you say physical year, people just aren't going to take you seriously, because it's like calling an M4 a gun. Professionals don't do that. Now, there is something called a calendar year, and that's the thing that runs from the 1st of January until the 31st of December. But the federal fiscal year, it runs from the 1st of October to the 30th of September. When Congress gives federal agencies the authority to spend taxpayer money, they do it with a piece of legislation that's called an appropriation. And as we talked about in our video on the color of money, an appropriation has 3 primary limits put on it: purpose, time, and amount. In general, that time limitation says that the money appropriated has to be spent within a specific fiscal year. And so, as we're making our way through September, the final month of the fiscal year, the clock is ticking down to fully appropriate the total amount of money that was appropriated. And so as the end of the fiscal year is starting to bear down on us, comptrollers and contracting officers, budgeting offices, and S4 shops are scrambling to make sure that the money gets obligated to get as much benefit as possible from it. And that brings us to how you can use this information to your benefit. September, and especially the last 2 weeks of September, are an insanely busy time for your friends in finance. In fact, fiscal New Year's Eve, September 30th, is like some kind of witch's Sabbath. The finance folks work way past midnight, and they're all gaggled together and passing back and forth messages so that they can get the final arcane financial actions completed. This is not the time to try to get their input on some piece of, uniform policy, because even if they normally would care, right around the end of the year, they got bigger fish to fry. And just so you're tracking, in 2023, the 30th of September is going to land on a Saturday. It is going to be a long weekend for the guys with the green eye shades, and if you want to win some points with them, just give them space. If they need something, give it to them. And bear in mind that on Monday, October 2nd, they're going to be a little groggy. The next way to use this information is just to plan ahead. In these final moments, relatively small amounts of money, especially operations and maintenance money, can suddenly become available. And when I say relatively small, what I mean is like $100,000 to $1 million. A boss of mine used to maintain what he called buy lists. Basically, he'd have a list of what he would purchase if he got $200,000, $400,000, etc. And he didn't just double quantities or throw stuff on the list like it was some kind of Christmas wish list. His buy lists reflected a strategic logic. If he could only get $200,000, he'd buy the basics for A team and B team. But if he could get $400,000, he would fully kit out C team, and he wouldn't buy anything for team A and B. And then, if he could get like $600,000, he would back off, fully kitting out C team, and he'd get about 80% of what all the teams needed. Now, there are 2 beautiful parts to this premeditated and justified strategy. Number 1, when there was a last-minute request for things to buy, all he did was push send. First in, first funded. And number 2, because he had built a logic around what he was buying, he was in a much better position to compete against anybody else who might submit a list for what to buy. The final way to use this information about the fiscal year is to start tuning in to the rhythms of the federal bureaucracy. For junior NCOs and company-grade officers, the annual cycle of the federal budget might not mean very much. But the more you work in the Department of Defense and become familiar with the large patterns, the better able you are to predict what's going to happen next. And if you want to learn the basics of the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution cycle, watch this playlist.